The fall of the Carolingians, power vacuum in Central Europe. Long before the thundering castles and grand battles of medieval Germany, there was a kingdom that seemed unshakable yet crumbled faster than anyone expected. The Carolingians, heirs of Charlemagne's mighty empire, once held the threads of Europe tightly in their grasp. But by the middle of the 9th century, those threads began to snap, leaving Central Europe in a dangerous, uncertain silence. And in that silence, everything changed. Before we dive deeper, a little reminder. Let's aim for 1,000 likes on this video. It helps keep these stories coming. And yes, it's as important as the intrigues we're about to uncover. Charlemagne's empire, stretching from the Atlantic to the Elbe, had seemed eternal. His rule was defined by grand visions, the unification of lands, the promotion of learning, and the deep intertwining of church and state. But like any empire that spreads too thin, cracks started to form. When Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, took over, the empire began to wobble. He was devout and scholarly, but also indecisive, struggling to balance family loyalties and the demands of ruling a vast territory. His reign highlighted a problem that would haunt Europe for decades. Succession disputes could destabilize even the most powerful dynasties. By the time Louis died, his sons were already eyeing each other with suspicion. The empire was sliced and diced through the Treaty of Verdun in 843. Suddenly, what was once a single, commanding force became fragmented into East, West, and Middle Francia. East Francia, roughly the heart of what we now call Germany, found itself at the center of a political vacuum. No single leader could claim unquestioned authority. Local nobles, bishops, and counts suddenly gained influence beyond anything Charlemagne could have imagined. In many ways, this period set the stage for the tensions between kings and princes that we'll explore later, and even foreshadows the secretive power of the electors who would emerge centuries afterward. This power vacuum wasn't just political. It seeped into everyday life. Lords fortified their holdings, while peasants felt the first real taste of the shifting tides of authority. Alliances formed and broke as fast as lightning. Remember later when we talk about the Hohenstaufen versus Welf rivalry. The roots of that dynastic conflict are tangled in these very early disputes for control. Families learned quickly that power was as much about cunning and alliances as it was about heritage. And, as we'll see, some ambitious leaders, like Otto III, would later try to pull these threads together again, with varying success. The collapse of central authority also invited outsiders. Vikings, Magyars, and Saracen raiders probed the borders of East Francia, testing the fragility of local defences. Without a strong emperor to organise a defence, many regions relied on local militias and hastily constructed fortresses, a theme that will reappear when we discuss the castles of conquest. In many ways, these chaotic decades after the Carolingians' fall created a laboratory for medieval politics. Nobles learned to negotiate power, cities began cultivating independence, and the seeds of long-lasting Germanic institutions were quietly sown. The story of the Carolingians' fall is more than a tale of weak rulers and fractured lands. It's a reminder that even the mightiest empires are only as strong as their leaders' ability to manage human ambition. And it's here, in the quiet gaps left by their absence, that the drama of medieval Germany truly begins. The echoes of this power vacuum ripple forward through every battle, intrigue, and revolt we'll explore in this series. So, as you settle in and let these early medieval stories unfold, think about this. Empires rise and fall, but human ambition, conflict, and intrigue that never fades. And hey, let's hit that 1,000 likes milestone. It's a small act of support that keeps these stories alive and thriving. Emergence of regional powers. The early Germanic principalities. After Charlemagne's death, the vast empire he had built began to show cracks. What seemed like a unified realm under his iron-firm hand quickly unravelled, not through sudden collapse, but through the slow, almost inevitable pull of regional loyalties. The Carolingian Empire had been held together by a combination of military might, religious legitimacy, and Charlemagne's personal authority, but once he was gone, those threads began to fray. Local lords, counts, and dukes started exercising more autonomy, and the seeds of Germany's fragmented political landscape were firmly planted. This was the birth of the early Germanic principalities. Regions like Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia, and Swabia began to assert themselves as semi-independent powers. They weren't outright kingdoms, at least not yet, but they had their own laws, their own armies, and their own ambitions. The central authority of a king or emperor was more a distant idea than a practical reality. For common people, it meant that life was heavily shaped by local rulers rather than some distant imperial edict. Lords collected taxes, demanded military service, and often settled disputes in ways that served their interests first. The landscape of power was localized, deeply feudal, and often unpredictable. This fragmentation laid the foundation for the dynastic rivalries that would dominate German politics for centuries. Noble families like the Ludolfings, the Ottonians, and later the Hohenstaufens and Welfs began to see themselves as semi-sovereign powers. Marriage alliances, inheritances, and family disputes became as important as battles in determining the balance of power. Each principality developed its own identity and ambitions, which would later feed into conflicts over the Holy Roman throne. The tension between a strong central ruler and ambitious regional princes became a recurring theme, shaping the empire's history from Otto I through to the Habsburgs. Feudal structures were essential to understanding how these principalities functioned. Land was the currency of power, granted to vassals in exchange for loyalty and military service. This created a layered society where authority trickled down from dukes to counts and further to knights and local administrators. On the one hand, it provided a measure of stability and military organization. On the other, it fragmented authority and made centralized control extremely difficult. Even when emperors like Otto I tried to consolidate power, they had to navigate this patchwork of loyalties carefully, balancing favors, marriages, and threats to maintain influence. The principalities weren't just political entities, they were cultural centers as well. Each developed distinct legal codes, trade practices, and alliances with the church. Bishops often played a dual role, wielding spiritual authority while also acting as power brokers between rival princes. This mixture of secular and ecclesiastical influence created a complex web where loyalty was fluid and ambition was constant. A count might side with the emperor one year and align with a neighboring duke the next, depending on which alliance promised greater advantage. By the time the Holy Roman Empire formally emerged, this fragmentation was deeply entrenched. The empire would always be a mosaic of semi-independent principalities, cities, and ecclesiastical territories. Regional powers held real sway, forcing emperors to negotiate, compromise, or resort to military force to assert authority. This balance, or imbalance between central ambition and regional autonomy, defined German politics throughout the medieval period. In short, The early Germanic principalities show us how Germany became a patchwork of competing powers. The fall of the Carolingians didn't just create a vacuum, it created a dynamic political landscape where local rulers thrived, loyalties shifted, and dynasties vied for supremacy. These principalities set the stage for everything that followed: the dynastic conflicts, feudal intricacies, and the eventual formation of the Holy Roman Empire. They were the building blocks of medieval Germany, each one a small kingdom in its own right, collectively shaping the destiny of a continent in ways that would echo for centuries. Crown versus princes. Who really ruled Germany? Germany in the Middle Ages wasn't a neatly organized kingdom like you might picture from fairy tales. Instead, it was a patchwork of power struggles, rivalries, and endless negotiations. When you hear Holy Roman Emperor, it sounds like someone wielded absolute authority, but the reality? The emperor often had less direct control than many of the princes under him. Yes, those dukes, margraves, and bishops you've read about weren't just ceremonial nobles, they were power players in their own right, sometimes calling the shots more effectively than the crown itself. So, how did this strange dynamic emerge? After the fall of the Carolingians, central authority in Germany weakened. When the Holy Roman Empire was established under the shadow of Charlemagne, the emperor inherited a vast territory, but it came with a catch. The lands weren't unified under a central bureaucracy. Instead, they were divided among regional lords who had been ruling their territories for generations. These princes had armies, collected taxes, controlled justice, and in many cases were wealthier than the emperor. They weren't just vassals, they were independent rulers with their own agendas. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is the delicate dance between the emperor and these princes. Emperors needed their support to get anything done: raising armies, enforcing laws, or levying taxes. Without the princes' cooperation, an emperor's authority could quickly evaporate. In some ways, the real power was behind the throne, in the hands of those who controlled the land and the money. Think of it as a medieval tug-of-war. The crown symbolized unity, but the princes held the rope. The system of elections added another layer to this power struggle. The emperor wasn't automatically the eldest son of the previous ruler. He had to be elected by a group of elite princes known as electors. This meant that from the very beginning of their reign, emperors were indebted to these powerful figures. Negotiations, favors, and alliances were not optional. They were survival tactics. You could say the princes were the kingmakers, and sometimes kingbreakers. A rebellious prince could paralyze an emperor's plans, while a loyal one could make a weak ruler appear strong. Conflict wasn't rare. There were moments when emperors tried to assert full control, and the princes resisted fiercely. Otto III, for instance, had grand ambitions to centralize authority, but the entrenched power of the nobles made every move a political chess game. And that tension between central authority and regional autonomy persisted for centuries. Battles weren't just fought with swords, they were fought in courts, councils, and through marriages designed to secure influence. What makes this period even more intriguing is that this struggle wasn't just political. It shaped the culture of medieval Germany. Towns, cities, and even religious institutions had to navigate between imperial decrees and local princes' demands. Some cities thrived because they could play one power against the other, leveraging independence for trade and wealth. Others suffered under constant disputes over taxes, soldiers, or religious control. The balance of power between crown and princes influenced everything from architecture to commerce to daily life for ordinary people. By the time the later emperors came around, the pattern was clear. The crown was a symbol, but the princes often held the real levers of power. And yet, the emperor's role wasn't meaningless. Their ability to mediate disputes, sanction laws, and serve as a unifying figure gave the empire a fragile cohesion that allowed it to last centuries. The interplay between crown and princes created a dynamic, complicated, and often chaotic political landscape, one where authority was never absolute and power was always negotiated. So, when we think about who really ruled Germany in the Middle Ages, the answer isn't straightforward. The emperor carried the title, the prestige, and the ceremonial power, but the princes, through wealth, armies, and political cunning, often pulled the strings behind the scenes. The crown may have worn the crown, but in practice, Germany was a realm where influence was earned, fought for, and constantly contested, making the medieval empire as fascinatingly complex as it was unpredictable. This delicate dance between symbolic authority and practical power is what defined medieval Germany, a land where titles mattered. But true control always required negotiation, strategy, and a deep understanding of the intricate web of loyalties that held the empire together. The electors' secret power, kingmakers behind the throne. You might think the king sits on his throne, ruling over the land with absolute power, but in medieval Germany, that was often more of a polite illusion than reality. The real power didn't always lie with the crowned monarch. It rested in the hands of a select few. The prince, electors. These were not just any nobles. They were the kingmakers, the people who could decide who would wear the crown and who would walk away empty-handed. And the story of their influence is a tangled web of politics, ambition, and quiet manipulation that shaped the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. Long before a new emperor was crowned, alliances were brokered in whispered meetings behind castle doors. The electors, usually 7 in number after the Golden Bull of 1356, held the extraordinary privilege of electing the king. 3 of them were ecclesiastical leaders, archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and 4 were secular princes, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. Together, they wielded influence that could make or break an emperor's reign before it even began. But their power was far more subtle than armies or taxes. A king needed their support to secure legitimacy, which meant flattery, gifts, and political concessions became everyday currency. Negotiations often lasted months, with promises exchanged like cards in a high-stakes game. Some emperors learned this the hard way. Otto III, for instance, tried to centralize authority across the empire, but without the electors' goodwill, his ambitions met constant resistance, a reminder that even a crowned ruler could be hamstrung by these invisible hands. The electors didn't just influence succession, they shaped policy long after the coronation. An emperor who angered a single elector risked rebellion, economic sabotage, or withdrawal of military support. They could tilt decisions in favor of their own territories, force compromises on taxation, or push through church appointments. In a sense, the emperor was a figurehead balanced delicately on the fulcrum of electoral approval. This is why feudal life, with its lords, vassals, and brutal loyalties, often intersected with the grand politics of the throne. Everyone from the highest prince to the humblest vassal felt the ripple effects of these choices. It's fascinating to see how religion and politics intertwined here as well. The archbishops weren't just spiritual leaders, they were political strategists who leveraged their positions to protect the church's influence. Rivalries between secular princes and bishops sometimes escalated into full-blown conflicts. Yet, at the electoral table, they were partners in maintaining the delicate balance of imperial power. The system may have seemed chaotic, but it was surprisingly effective at preventing any single ruler from dominating Germany entirely. And intrigue was never far away. Behind closed doors, promises were broken, alliances shifted, and plots brewed, reminding us of later episodes of assassination and betrayal that shook the empire. Even the rise of cities like those in the Hanseatic League was influenced indirectly, as electors and emperors alike had to negotiate taxes, trade rights, and military protection. Every decision by the electors sent ripples through society, from peasants to princes, and even affected responses to crises like the Black Death or mercenary violence. By the end of the day, the electors' power was a masterclass in quiet authority. They didn't always need armies or banners. A nod, a handshake, or a strategic silence could change the fate of the empire. Their legacy reminds us that history isn't just about kings and battles, it's about the unseen forces, the people pulling strings behind the scenes, who often shape the story more than those in the spotlight. So the next time you think of a medieval king ruling with absolute power, remember the electors quietly steering the empire, their influence echoing through centuries of German history, long before modern states claimed centralized authority. Hohenstaufen versus Welf rivalry. Dynasties at war. If you think medieval Germany was just about kings in shiny armor and sleepy villages, think again. There was a war brewing that didn't just shake the battlefield, it tore apart entire regions, reshaped alliances, and made ordinary people question who even held power. I'm talking about the legendary clash between the Hohenstaufens and the Welfs, two dynasties whose feud would define German politics for decades. This wasn't a simple family squabble, it was a fight for the very soul of the Holy Roman Empire. It all started in the late 11th century, when the empire was still finding its footing after the fall of the Carolingians and the rise of the Ottonians. Power in Germany was never straightforward. Kings were supposed to rule, but princes and dukes had teeth of their own. Enter the Hohenstaufens, a dynasty with eyes on imperial authority, and the Welfs, equally ambitious nobles who weren't going to bow quietly. Their rivalry wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Marriages, land disputes, and claims to the throne all fueled a fire that would burn for generations. One of the most famous sparks was the contest over the kingship after the death of Emperor Henry IV. The Welfs backed one claimant, the Hohenstaufens another. Suddenly, the whole empire felt like a chessboard where bishops and dukes were moving pawns, knights and rooks, except real people were paying the price. Cities and castles aligned with one family or the other, often changing sides as fortunes shifted. And these weren't just battles of swords, they were battles of influence, with church leaders, mercenaries, and even common townsfolk dragged into the turmoil. Speaking of the church, remember how later the church and state often clashed? This rivalry is an early example both dynasties needed the Pope's blessing to legitimize their claims, turning religious authority into a weapon. The Hohenstaufens, particularly Frederick I Barbarossa, were relentless. They sought to centralize power, push back rebellious princes, and assert imperial dominance in Italy and across the empire. But the Welfs, with their strong base in Bavaria and Saxony, refused to be sidelined. Battles erupted, territories were besieged, and political marriages became strategic traps. This isn't far removed from the intrigue we'll see later with assassinations, poisonings, and throne conspiracies. The seeds were sown here, and the common people? They were caught in the crossfire, paying taxes, providing soldiers, and sometimes rebelling themselves. It's a grim reminder that while dynasties fought for glory, ordinary Germans were living under constant uncertainty. It also connects to the later peasant revolts and mercenary issues that plagued Germany. These feuds created a culture where conflict was normalized, and power was always negotiable. Eventually, the rivalry shaped the structure of the empire itself. The tension between central authority and local princes became a defining feature of medieval Germany. The Hohenstaufens could push imperial ambitions, but the Welfs ensured that no emperor could rule unchecked. This tug-of-war over power echoes in later events. Otto III's centralization attempts, the rise of independent imperial cities, and even the Habsburg marriages that would come centuries later. Every twist in this story reminds us that Germany wasn't just a kingdom, it was a mosaic of competing forces, each determined to leave its mark. By the time the dust settled, the rivalry had left the empire both fractured and transformed. Castles stood as symbols of conquest, cities had tasted autonomy, and the balance between king and princes had shifted forever. The Hohenstaufen-Welf feud was more than a family quarrel. It was a blueprint for medieval German politics, showing us how ambition, loyalty, and rivalry could shape an entire nation. And as we move forward, you'll see echoes of this war in everything from imperial elections to the Black Death's power shifts. Germany was never simple, and these two dynasties proved it. The story of their clash is messy, brutal, and fascinating, and it's only one chapter in the epic saga of medieval Germany. Otto III's ambitions, centralization or overreach. In the year 997, a young emperor stepped onto a throne that carried both awe and danger. Otto III was just a teenager when he inherited the Holy Roman Empire, yet his vision was larger than anyone could imagine. Some called him a genius, others a dreamer, and many whispered that he aimed far beyond what a mortal king should dare. But what exactly was Otto trying to do? Was he a centralizer, trying to bring order, or an overreacher courting disaster? Otto grew up steeped in the legacy of Charlemagne and his father, Otto II. He had learned that a ruler's power didn't just lie in armies or titles, but in symbolism, religion, and the intricate dance with powerful nobles. Unlike his predecessors, Otto III believed in a united Christian empire, stretching far beyond Germany into Italy, and even influencing the papacy itself. This wasn't a casual ambition, it was almost spiritual. He envisioned an empire that mirrored the glory of ancient Rome, blending sacred authority with secular rule. But blending those worlds was never easy, and the German princes, whom we've seen holding secretive powers behind thrones, were not about to give up their autonomy willingly. One of Otto's boldest moves was his close involvement with the papacy. He saw the Pope not as a rival, but as an ally, a key to strengthening his imperial vision. He even travelled to Rome personally, a risky endeavour considering the turbulent politics of the city. The Pope at the time, Gregory V, was barely a teenager, and Otto used his influence to secure papal support for his reforms. It worked, at least temporarily. But in Germany, this approach was controversial. Local princes resented an emperor who seemed more focused on Rome than on their own lands. Some saw Otto's devotion to centralization as necessary for order. Others called it blatant overreach. Otto's ideas didn't stop at alliances with the church. He reorganized the administration, attempting to reduce the power of independent dukes and assert imperial authority over far-flung territories. He appointed loyal bishops and officials, relying on their allegiance rather than the traditional feudal bonds. This approach echoed the later struggles between crown and princes that we'll see more fully in the Hohenstaufen versus Welf rivalry. In fact, Otto's reforms can be seen as a precursor to centuries of tension over whether Germany would be ruled by a strong central authority or remain a patchwork of semi-independent principalities. But ambition has a price. Otto's focus on Rome and imperial dreams sometimes left Germany vulnerable. Rebellions flared, and the empire's vast territories were difficult to govern without the immediate presence of the emperor. Some nobles, emboldened by his absence, began testing boundaries, while Otto's reforms stirred resentment. And yet, there's something almost poetic about his vision. A young ruler trying to revive the grandeur of ancient Rome in the heart of medieval Europe. It's a dream that feels both inspiring and dangerously idealistic. Otto III died young, at just 22, leaving behind a legacy that is still debated. Was he a brilliant reformer, a visionary who tried to shape a unified empire, or was he a cautionary tale of overreach whose lofty ambitions clashed with the realities of medieval politics? Either way, his reign connects to many threads we've already seen: the struggle for authority after the fall of the Carolingians, the subtle power of princes and electors, and the tensions between church and state that would shape Germany for centuries. Otto's story reminds us that history isn't just a series of battles and dates, it's the story of ideas, dreams, and the delicate balance between vision and reality. His life shows how ambition can push a kingdom forward, but also how it can spark conflict that echoes long after a ruler is gone. And as you follow these tales of medieval Germany, think of Otto III, a young emperor whose reach may have exceeded his grasp, yet whose imagination left an indelible mark on history. Feudal life unveiled. Lords, vassals, and brutal loyalties. Step into medieval Germany, and you quickly realize life was a lot less about grand banners and heroic knights than it was about obligation, hierarchy, and survival. At the heart of this world was the feudal system, a web of loyalties that tied peasants, knights, and lords together in a chain as fragile as it was rigid. If you think feudalism was just a set of rules, think again. It was a living, breathing system that dictated who ate, who fought, and who wielded power. And if you were on the wrong end of a lord's temper, it could be brutally unforgiving. At the top of the pyramid stood the lords, the real power brokers of medieval Germany. They owned the land, commanded the soldiers, and wielded authority that extended to life and death in many cases. But their power wasn't absolute. Each lord relied on vassals, lesser nobles, who swore loyalty in exchange for protection or parcels of land called fiefs. This wasn't a casual handshake. It was a binding relationship, sealed with oaths and ceremonies, sometimes even blood. A vassal's first loyalty was to his lord, which often created a tangled network of competing obligations. One knight might owe allegiance to multiple lords, each with their own agenda, and navigating that balance was a dangerous game. For the average person, feudal life was even harsher. Peasants, who made up the bulk of the population, were bound to the land they worked, providing food and labor to support the noble class above them. Life for them was repetitive, grueling, and often perilous. They had few rights and little mobility. Yet, the system provided some stability. The Lord's protection meant that, despite raids, banditry, or local conflicts, there was some order in their daily lives. Still, rebellions did erupt, most famously in the later German peasant uprisings, but these were risky and often brutally crushed, reinforcing the harsh hierarchy that defined medieval society. The obligations between lords and vassals weren't limited to labor or military service. Loyalty was a currency of its own. A vassal could be called to fight in distant campaigns, attend his lord's court, or even act as a mediator in local disputes. In return, the lord was supposed to provide protection and uphold justice, a promise that wasn't always honoured. Breaches of loyalty could lead to sieges, confiscation of lands, or even execution. In such a system, personal honour and political survival were intertwined, creating a world where betrayal, intrigue, and shifting alliances were everyday realities. Interestingly, this feudal network also shaped the power of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember how we talked about the emergence of regional principalities? Their strength came in large part from this very system. Princes and dukes used feudal obligations to consolidate power locally, sometimes at the emperor's expense. Even the most ambitious rulers, like Otto III, had to negotiate with a patchwork of powerful nobles who were often more loyal to their own fiefs than to the throne. This tension between central authority and local power would persist for centuries, influencing every rebellion, alliance, and coronation. Feudal life wasn't just a political structure. It defined the culture, economy, and social norms of medieval Germany. Castles, the fortified homes of lords, were symbols of authority but also hubs for the complex relationships of vassals and retainers. Knights, bound by codes of loyalty and martial skill, were both protectors and enforcers. And the church often intertwined itself into this system, granting spiritual legitimacy to secular lords while benefiting from the labour and allegiance of vassals. By understanding feudal life, you can see how Germany became a patchwork of loyalties, power struggles, and social hierarchies. A world where personal loyalty could mean wealth, survival, or death. It was a system both brutally restrictive and ingeniously adaptive, giving structure to a society that might otherwise have collapsed into chaos. Feudalism was more than rules and titles. It was the lifeblood of medieval Germany, shaping every rebellion, alliance, and ambition that would define the centuries to come. Castles of conquest. Defensive fortresses or tyranny symbols. When you think of a medieval castle, what comes to mind? Towering stone walls, banners snapping in the wind, knights patrolling the battlements. But behind those impressive facades, castles were more than just picturesque fortresses. They were statements of power, and sometimes instruments of fear. In medieval Germany, these stone giants weren't simply built to fend off invaders. They were built to control people. To understand why, you have to dive into the world of feudal life, where loyalty was enforced as much by walls as by words. Castles started as practical structures. High atop hills or along river bends, they provided a strategic advantage against rival lords and external threats. Think of a small town with a looming keep above it. The castle's presence alone could deter bandits or hostile neighbours. Soldiers stationed inside could monitor trade routes, collect tolls, and respond quickly to rebellion. But the very same walls that protected towns also made them prisons of a sort. Those living under a castle's shadow were constantly reminded who was in charge. The lord's authority wasn't just legal, it was visual and omnipresent. Some castles, like Hohenstaufen strongholds, were designed for true military defence, with thick walls, moats, and arrow slits. Others leaned more toward intimidation, acting as a statement that a noble or prince had the resources to dominate the surrounding land. In regions where central authority was weak, such as during the ongoing power struggles between crown and princes, castles became the backbone of a local ruler's autonomy. They were not just homes, they were symbols that said, "I am the law here." Inside, castles were equally complex. The keep wasn't only for the lord's family, it housed soldiers, administrators, and sometimes even displaced peasants seeking refuge. But life within those walls was far from idyllic. While some castles became centers of culture and governance, many were centers of oppression. Lords could impose taxes, demand labor, or even imprison those who defied them, all while shielded by their stone fortresses. In a very real sense, castles embodied the dual nature of medieval power: protective, yet coercive. The political importance of castles extended beyond local control. During disputes between emperors and princes, castles were strategic assets. Holding a well-fortified stronghold could determine the outcome of a conflict. They were bargaining chips in wars of succession, tools to enforce alliances, and sometimes the stage for dramatic sieges. Remember the fierce Hohenstaufen-Welf rivalry? Castles were at the center of their battles, changing hands, being razed and rebuilt, each stone a reminder of shifting power. Religious authority wasn't immune either. Bishops and abbots controlled fortified monasteries that mirrored the military castles of secular lords. These ecclesiastical fortresses allowed church leaders to wield both spiritual and temporal power, enforcing their will over lands and towns. In many ways, castles, whether noble or clerical, blurred the line between defense and domination. Yet, despite the fear they could inspire, castles were also hubs of economic activity. Markets often flourished nearby, artisans found work in construction or maintenance, and peasants could seek limited refuge in times of danger. Castles were paradoxes. Symbols of tyranny, yes, but also engines of local stability and community life. So, when you look at medieval Germany's castles today, it's tempting to see them as fairy tale relics, but in their own time, they were much more than stone and mortar. They were weapons, homes, and visual declarations of power. Each castle tells a story of conquest, control, and sometimes cruelty. They stand as monuments to the duality of medieval authority, protective fortresses for some, instruments of domination for others. In every stone you can almost hear the echoes of armies, negotiations, and the everyday lives of people living under the shadow of power, caught between safety and subjugation, forbidden knowledge and secret societies. In medieval Germany, knowledge wasn't just power, it was dangerous, coveted, and often hidden in shadowy corners of monasteries, castles, and secret chambers. People whispered about alchemists who spent decades chasing the impossible, scholars who studied the stars in secrecy, and mysterious brotherhoods whose rituals were more than just tradition. They were keys to hidden wisdom. This was a world where curiosity could bring fame or fatal suspicion, and where forbidden knowledge shaped not only minds but the very fabric of society. Alchemists were perhaps the most famous seekers of forbidden truths. Long before chemistry became a formal science, these men sometimes cloaked in robes, sometimes disguised as monks, devoted their lives to transforming base metals into gold. The allure of wealth was obvious, but their obsession went beyond material gain. Hidden in monasteries and the secluded towers of castles, alchemists conducted secret experiments with strange powders, bubbling liquids, and cryptic symbols. Some claimed to be chasing the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could grant immortality. Others documented recipes and observations in coded manuscripts, ensuring that only the initiated could decipher their secrets. It was a delicate balance. Success promised riches and recognition, but failure, or being discovered by a suspicious noble or cleric, could mean disgrace or worse. Meanwhile, early scientists and scholars were quietly laying the foundations for modern knowledge. Astronomy, astrology, and early chemistry were often intertwined. Monks charted the heavens, trying to predict eclipses or divine human fate, while proto-chemists experimented with metals and minerals. Many of these scholars were also deeply involved in mystical studies, seeing the natural world as a reflection of hidden cosmic patterns. Astrology, for example, wasn't merely superstition. It guided political decisions, marriage alliances, and even military campaigns. Secret observations and calculations, often recorded in coded notebooks, were considered too potent to share openly with the uninitiated. The tension between science and mysticism created a unique intellectual environment where curiosity was both revered and feared. Secret societies and brotherhoods added another layer of intrigue. Guilds and associations weren't only about trade or craft, they often carried hidden rituals, symbols, and rules known only to members. Apprentices were initiated into mysteries that bonded them to the guild, and some societies even traced their origins to the mystical knowledge of the ancients. These brotherhoods served as protectors of wisdom, ensuring that dangerous or powerful ideas didn't fall into the wrong hands. They also acted as networks, connecting scholars, alchemists, and influential figures across Germany and beyond, quietly shaping political, scientific, and economic developments from the shadows. And then there were the forbidden texts. Manuscripts filled with magical incantations, astrological charts, or philosophical speculation circulated secretly among the educated elite. Some of these texts contained knowledge considered heretical by the Church. Others were so cryptic that only a few could understand them. Monks and scholars copied these works in hidden script, often hiding them behind false pages or within the bindings of other books. These manuscripts weren't just intellectual curiosities, they were keys to power. Capable of influencing rulers, guiding secret societies, or even inspiring revolts, knowledge itself became a dangerous game. The right secret in the wrong hands could shift the balance of power in the empire. The interplay between alchemists, early scientists, secret societies, and forbidden texts paints a picture of medieval Germany as a place of hidden ambitions and quiet revolutions of the mind. While kings and bishops battled openly for territory and authority, another struggle unfolded behind closed doors, a contest of knowledge, secrecy, and innovation. Those who dared to seek forbidden wisdom risked scandal, imprisonment, or death. But they also planted the seeds for modern science, philosophy, and even political thought. In many ways, the invisible hands of these secret seekers shaped the empire as much as armies or royal decrees ever could. Religious rivalries. Bishops versus secular princes. You might think medieval Germany was all knights, castles, and kings shouting orders, but there was another battlefield, quieter but just as dangerous. The tension between bishops and secular princes. This wasn't just about faith or piety, it was about who really held power, and sometimes a single bishop could rival the authority of a king. Imagine a world where a man in a robe could command armies, collect taxes, and negotiate treaties often more effectively than the so-called ruler of the land. That was the reality in the Holy Roman Empire. After the fall of the Carolingians, Germany became a patchwork of duchies, principalities, and ecclesiastical territories. Kings like those from the Hohenstaufen dynasty had to constantly negotiate with local power holders. But the Church wasn't a monolithic ally, it had its own ambitions. Bishops weren't just spiritual guides. They were feudal lords, controlling lands, wealth, and loyal troops. A bishop could summon vassals to fight, levy taxes, or even blockade a rebellious city. That meant when the emperor or king wanted to assert central authority, he often faced resistance not just from dukes and princes, but from bishops wielding comparable power. Take, for example, the investiture controversy, a conflict you've probably heard hinted at before in other parts of medieval German history. Kings tried to appoint bishops to secure loyalty, but popes insisted that only the church could make these decisions. This tug of war wasn't abstract. It sparked wars, rebellions, and intricate political maneuvers. Princes sided with one faction or the other, and suddenly a religious dispute had real consequences on borders, alliances, and the fate of cities. Even within a single diocese, loyalties could split, leaving towns caught between secular taxes and ecclesiastical demands. And it wasn't always armies and bloodshed. Political marriages, treaties, and careful alliances became weapons. A prince might marry into a bishop's family or pledge support to a favoured candidate, while a clever bishop could use papal authority to block a rival's ambitions. This intricate dance of influence shaped much of the empire's politics. In fact, the power struggle between bishops and princes set the stage for later conflicts, like the Hohenstaufen Welf rivalry and the rise of independent imperial cities, which we'll explore later. Interestingly, this rivalry also affected everyday life. Peasants, craftsmen, and townspeople were the unseen players who bore the brunt of these disputes. Taxes, tithes, and forced labour often increased whenever a bishop or prince flexed power, and superstition wasn't just a spiritual matter, it was political. Bishops could invoke divine authority to justify harsh punishments, while princes might accuse rival bishops of heresy to weaken them. This fear and manipulation connect directly to later events like witch hunts, where belief and politics intertwined in deadly ways. Money, too, played a central role. Bishops controlled trade routes, tolls, and markets, sometimes rivaling wealthy secular princes. The rise of merchant leagues, like the Hanseatic League, began to challenge both ecclesiastical and princely power. But in these early centuries, a bishop's word often carried as much weight as any duke's sword. Cities had to navigate this delicate balance carefully, forging charters, buying privileges, or siding with whichever power promised protection and profit. By the 14th century, the interplay between church and state had become a defining feature of German politics. Bishops weren't just spiritual leaders, they were kingmakers, advisors, and occasionally kingbreakers. Secular princes, meanwhile, learned to use religious authority as leverage, ensuring that no single ruler could dominate the complex tapestry of the empire. This tension explains why centralization efforts, like those attempted by Otto III or later Hohenstaufen emperors, were never straightforward. The empire was as much about negotiation, intrigue, and religious authority as it was about battlefields and crowns. The story of bishops versus princes shows us that medieval Germany was never black and white. Power was layered, intertwined, and constantly shifting. It wasn't simply about who held a sword, it was about who controlled belief, loyalty, and the very idea of authority. And as we continue exploring the empire, you'll see how this struggle influenced revolts, alliances, and even the rise of the Habsburgs. Medieval Germany's history is messy, fascinating, and shaped as much by robes as it was by armour. Peasant revolts. When the bottom raged against the top, the sound of footsteps pounding across muddy fields, the clatter of farm tools turned weapons, and the distant cries of lords in panic. It wasn't a battlefield between knights and kings, but between peasants and the very people who ruled over them. In medieval Germany, life wasn't just castles, crowns, and imperial politics. For the majority, survival meant endless labour under crushing obligations. Yet, every so often, those who tilled the land, milked the cows, and bore the weight of feudal taxes rose up, in defiance, reminding the powerful that the bottom could, indeed, roar. And before we dive further, a little reminder, if you're enjoying these stories, hit that like button. We're aiming for 1,000 likes to keep bringing history alive. Life for peasants was brutal. Most were tied to the land, working fields that barely fed their families while paying heavy rents and taxes to their local lords. Feudal obligations weren't suggestions, they were enforced with threat of violence. If a lord demanded labour, a peasant obeyed. If a tax increased, there was little choice but to pay. And yet, the system wasn't always consistent. Some lords were cruel, others somewhat fair, but the imbalance of power was unmistakable. You might think that enduring this would breed quiet acceptance, but history tells a different story. The most famous waves of peasant unrest culminated in the German Peasants' War of 1525, though revolts had flared for centuries before that. Peasants organised secret meetings, drafted lists of grievances, and even attempted to assert their rights under customary law. They demanded fairer rents, relief from arbitrary punishment, and freedom from oppressive obligations. And when negotiations failed, they marched. Torches in hand, pitchforks raised, they confronted the very lords who had dominated their lives. The images alone are striking. Unarmed villagers challenging armoured knights, communities standing together against centuries of hierarchy. Of course, the revolts weren't always successful. In most cases, the reaction was swift and brutal. Lords hired mercenaries like the ones we'll discuss in another subtopic, who crushed uprisings with overwhelming force. Villages were burned, leaders executed, and survivors left even more tightly controlled than before. And yet, the revolts left a mark. They demonstrated that the peasants were not passive pawns. They were human beings capable of resistance, capable of challenging the very system that defined medieval Germany. Interestingly, these uprisings often intersected with other tensions in the empire. The same feudal fragmentation that Otto III struggled to control, and the ambitions of princes and bishops jockeying for influence, created cracks in authority that peasants could exploit. And superstition and fear, which we'll see played a major role in witch hunts and social control, sometimes added fuel to revolts. Rumours of injustice, or the wrath of God, could spark rebellion just as quickly as taxes or forced labour. In this way, peasant revolts were part of the larger story of medieval Germany, intertwined with political, social, and religious currents that ran from the castles of conquest to the court intrigues of powerful dynasties. One of the most fascinating aspects is how these revolts influenced later history. The Black Death, for instance, drastically shifted labour dynamics, giving surviving peasants more bargaining power, and the rise of independent imperial cities, like those in the Hanseatic League, also reflected a broader movement where those outside traditional aristocratic power could carve out wealth and autonomy. Revolts reminded rulers and historians alike that authority was never guaranteed, and social stability could be fragile. So, when you think of medieval Germany, don't just picture kings, emperors, or ambitious princes. Think of the villagers in the fields, the common people whose defiance sometimes shook castles to their foundations. Theirs is a story of courage, endurance, and the relentless struggle for fairness in a world built to keep them down. It's a reminder that history isn't only shaped by the powerful, it's shaped by everyone willing to challenge them. Witch hunts and superstitions. Fear as political control. Medieval Germany wasn't just a land of castles and princes. It was also a place where fear ruled as much as kings did. Superstitions weren't harmless beliefs whispered around fires. They were tools of control. And nowhere was this more terrifyingly clear than during the witch hunts. Across towns and villages, accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire, and suddenly neighbors, friends, or even family members could become enemies overnight. But here's the chilling part. These hunts were never just about superstition. They were political instruments, ways for rulers, nobles, and even church leaders to consolidate power and manipulate the masses. It all started with anxiety. Times were hard crop failures, plagues, and wars left communities vulnerable and looking for someone to blame. The church, already entwined with political authority, portrayed witches as agents of the devil, reinforcing fear while giving itself moral justification to intervene. Princes and lords saw opportunity in this fear. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a convenient way to seize property, eliminate rivals, or enforce obedience. It was a perfect storm. Religious authority, political ambition, and social panic fused into a deadly mechanism that targeted anyone considered inconvenient or threatening. The process was horrifyingly systematic. Local courts, often led by judges loyal to secular or ecclesiastical powers, would interrogate accused witches. Torture was common, designed to extract confessions that reinforced existing beliefs about witchcraft. These confessions then justified harsh punishment, often execution, creating a feedback loop of fear and control. In small towns, the witch hunt could destabilize social networks entirely. Neighbors turned against each other, families fractured, and loyalty became a survival tactic. It was fear weaponized, and rulers were the ones holding the lever. Interestingly, this environment of suspicion and control also intersected with other aspects of medieval German politics. Remember the feudal loyalties we discussed earlier? A lord who could inspire fear through punishment, intimidation, or witch accusations often found it easier to maintain obedience among vassals. Similarly, regional principalities sometimes competed for influence by demonstrating moral and legal authority over their territories. Witch hunts became a way to show power, signaling to other nobles and the populace that the ruler had the capacity to enforce order and suppress threats, real or imagined. Beyond politics, superstition shaped daily life. People believed the unseen governed their fate. Omens, charms, and rituals were taken seriously, not just by peasants, but by nobles too. Town councils often enacted laws regulating magic, labeling certain practices illegal, while religious authorities issued warnings and punishments. Fear of the supernatural was intertwined with fear of political reprisal, creating a climate where obedience was as much about survival as morality. Even those who were innocent found themselves participating in a system that normalized persecution, further entrenching the control of those in power. The witch hunts of medieval Germany are a stark example of how belief and politics intersected. They weren't merely cultural phenomena, they were mechanisms for social and political manipulation, tools that lords and bishops could use to shape communities and maintain hierarchies. The terror wasn't random, it was calculated, exploiting the anxieties of everyday life to enforce authority. It's a reminder that in medieval Germany, power wasn't just about armies or castles. It could also be wielded through fear, through stories, and through the very superstitions that people carried in their hearts. In the end, the shadow of these hunts lingers in our understanding of medieval Germany. They show how rulers manipulated belief to maintain control, how fear could enforce loyalty, and how ordinary people became pawns in political games cloaked as moral crusades. Witch hunts weren't just tragedy, they were strategy, a chilling testament to the ways power could operate beyond the battlefield, deep in the psyche of a society. The rise of the Hanseatic League. Money over monarchs. When you think of medieval Germany, castles and emperors often steal the spotlight, but behind the scenes, another kind of power was quietly taking shape. It wasn't measured in crowns or swords, but in coins, trade routes, and clever alliances. This was the Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant cities that, in many ways, became more powerful than kings. And their story completely changes how we think about medieval authority. The League began in the 12th century, born out of necessity. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen needed protection for their merchants travelling across Europe, from the Baltic to the North Sea. Pirates, feuding lords, and unpredictable weather made trade risky. By banding together, these cities could ensure safer passage, negotiate collectively, and even enforce trade agreements. What started as a practical alliance gradually evolved into something much bigger, a network that rivaled the influence of emperors and princes. Hanseatic merchants weren't just small-time traders. They controlled entire markets of goods, furs from the north, grain from the east, textiles from the Low Countries. Their wealth gave them leverage that no local prince could ignore. Unlike the fragmented authority of the German crown, the League had cohesion. Decisions were made collectively, and cities worked in tandem to protect mutual interests. If a monarch tried to impose taxes or regulations, the League could threaten trade boycotts or withdraw vital goods, often bending rulers to their will. In effect, money became a form of soft power that could override swords. The League's influence wasn't just economic, it was political. These cities negotiated treaties with kingdoms, arranged safe passage for merchants, and even maintained their own fleets. Think of it as a medieval corporation, but with armies and embassies. In many cases, princes had to rely on Hanseatic cities to maintain their own wealth and trade stability. A weak emperor couldn't enforce laws across the empire, but a united league could manipulate markets, finance armies, and protect its members against both local lords and external threats. It's easy to overlook how revolutionary this was. Traditionally, medieval authority depended on land, castles, and hereditary titles. But here was a new form of power: collective economic might. The League's cities acted almost like mini-states, governing themselves, enforcing justice, and controlling access to commerce. Lübeck, often called the Queen of the Hans, became a hub of diplomacy and negotiation, illustrating how trade could reshape politics. Even kings had to negotiate with merchants, sometimes more carefully than with other rulers. Conflict wasn't absent. Princes occasionally attempted to challenge the League's privileges, and rival cities tried to assert dominance. Yet the League's unity and the sheer importance of trade often ensured its survival. Over time, the Hanseatic League became a model of how economic alliances could rival traditional political hierarchies. While emperors squabbled over distant territories, merchants dictated terms in port cities, proving that money could sometimes wield more influence than the crown itself. The rise of the League also influenced everyday life. Common people benefited from more stable markets, but they were also caught in the crossfire of city rivalries and boycotts. Guilds, labour regulations, and trade monopolies shaped towns and commerce, creating a culture where negotiation and alliance mattered more than brute force. The League's shadow reached far beyond German borders, touching Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and even England, demonstrating that medieval Germany's influence wasn't confined to castles or emperors. It flowed along rivers, harbours, and trade routes. So, the story of the Hanseatic League reminds us that power in medieval Germany wasn't always about who wore a crown. Sometimes The real authority lay with the cities, their merchants, and their money. By organizing, collaborating, and leveraging commerce, the League created a network where wealth dictated influence, proving that even in a world dominated by lords and kings, coins could speak louder than swords. Their legacy is a lesson in how economic ingenuity can shift the balance of power, and how in medieval Germany, money often triumphed over monarchy. Assassinations and intrigue, poison, betrayal, and throne wars. Medieval Germany wasn't just about knights in shining armor or towering castles. It was a world where a whispered secret could topple kings, and a carefully hidden dagger could change the fate of an empire. Assassination and intrigue weren't exceptions. They were a grimly normal part of life, as rulers and rivals played a high-stakes game where betrayal was often more effective than brute force. If you think history is only about battles and laws, think again. Some of the most pivotal moments happened in shadowy rooms far from the battlefield. Political murder was not merely personal, it was strategic. The Holy Roman Empire, with its patchwork of semi-independent territories, created a fertile ground for rivalry. Princes, bishops, and ambitious nobles all sought influence, and sometimes the fastest path to power wasn't through the battlefield or the throne room, but through poison or sudden violence. Take Frederick II's era, for instance. Allegiances shifted like sand, and conspiracies could sprout from a single insult or broken promise. The stakes were life and death, and betrayal was a constant companion. Even the act of plotting was layered with drama and calculation. A failed assassination could ignite wars, but a successful one could elevate a minor noble or topple a king overnight. Courts buzzed with rumor, letters carried coded messages, and even religious figures sometimes facilitated or condoned plots if it suited the balance of power. Bishops, as we discussed earlier, weren't immune. Some wielded their spiritual authority to shield conspirators or manipulate outcomes to favor their own dynasties. The intersections between church and state were not just political. They were often deadly. One of the most infamous aspects of these intrigues was poison. Unlike the clashing swords of battlefield heroes, poison was invisible, silent, and terrifyingly effective. Cups of wine, shared meals, even ceremonial bread could become instruments of control. Trust was fragile. Kings had to be cautious even among their closest advisors, and courtiers developed elaborate strategies to protect themselves. Guards and loyalists could be bribed, threatened, or coerced, meaning survival often required both wit and paranoia. This culture of fear reverberated through every layer of society, from nobles to mercenaries, and even influenced the governance of imperial cities struggling for independence. Assassinations also played a role in larger dynastic struggles, such as the Hohenstaufen versus Welf rivalry. Entire families could rise or fall based on a single secret strike, shifting the political landscape for decades. And these violent episodes were rarely isolated. They were connected to other power plays, the electors' choices, bishops' manipulations, peasant revolts, or disputes over trade rights in the burgeoning Hanseatic League. The web of intrigue stretched across the empire, linking seemingly distant events into a single, tense narrative. Even with such dangers, rulers continued to engage in diplomacy and negotiation. The balance of trust and suspicion defined relationships, and many emperors learned to navigate these treacherous waters through alliances, gifts, or concessions. But the ever-present threat of betrayal meant that every coronation, every treaty, and every council meeting carried the potential for sudden catastrophe. In a world where a dagger in the dark could erase months of careful planning, strategy had to account for the unpredictable as much as the expected. Ultimately, Assassinations and intrigue were not just tools of chaos, they were a language of power. They reshaped borders, decided heirs, and altered the trajectory of the Holy Roman Empire in ways that armies alone could never achieve. The echoes of these betrayals are seen in later conflicts, mercenary violence, and even the political strategies of dynasties like the Habsburgs, who mastered the art of manipulation as much as conquest. So, when you picture medieval Germany, don't just think of towering castles or armoured knights. Think of secret chambers, poisoned goblets, and silent conspiracies where one misstep could cost a life or a crown. The empire was as much a stage for shadowy plots as it was for grand battles, and the people who survived its intrigues often shaped history far more profoundly than any victorious army could. Military mercenaries and banditry, soldiers for hire, terrorized towns. When you think of medieval Germany, you might picture knights in shining armor defending noble castles, but the reality was far darker. Imagine waking up to the sound of hooves and shouting outside your village, only to find that the people threatening your home weren't invading armies or rival kings. They were mercenaries, soldiers for hire, hired by whoever could pay them. And if no one paid, well, you could still become their target. These weren't stories from a far-off land, they were everyday life in the Holy Roman Empire, where violence was as common as taxes, and law was often whatever the strongest or richest claimed it to be. Mercenaries, known as Landsknecht later on, didn't always follow loyalties like knights bound to a lord. In the 12th and 13th centuries, small armies roamed the empire, seeking pay, plunder, or political leverage. Princes and bishops often hired these professional soldiers to enforce claims, seize rebellious towns, or intimidate rivals. But the problem was simple. Money talks, and mercenaries obeyed whoever had it. Sometimes that meant towns loyal to one prince could suddenly be pillaged by his own hired forces if funds ran short or if a rival offered a better price. Loyalty wasn't a virtue, it was a contract. And then there were the bandits. Not your romanticized Robin Hood type, but organized gangs of armed men who thrived in the chaos of a fragmented empire. They often included former mercenaries who had no one to pay them anymore. Forests, river valleys, and remote trade routes became perilous. Merchants traveling between imperial cities risked losing goods, money, or even their lives. The same roads that carried salt, wine, or cloth could also carry death. It's no surprise that urban centers started building walls and watchtowers not just to defend against foreign armies, but against the very soldiers hired to protect them. This lawlessness wasn't isolated, it ties directly to the power struggles we've seen earlier. The Hohenstaufen welf rivalry, bishops asserting authority, and princes consolidating power all created an environment where mercenaries were indispensable. But every army comes with a risk, and the more you hire, the more unpredictable the outcome. Sometimes mercenaries would switch sides mid-battle or demand higher pay mid-campaign, leaving their employers in chaos. Ordinary townsfolk often paid the price with looted grain, burned barns, and destroyed homes. Interestingly, these mercenary armies played a role in shaping German politics and economics. Towns began to organize militias. Fortifications became stronger, and trade guilds sometimes pooled resources to pay off or defend against roving soldiers. Cities that could protect themselves often thrived, which connects to the rise of imperial cities we'll discuss later. Wealthy towns had to navigate a tricky balance, paying for security while maintaining independence from princes and bishops. It was a constant negotiation, and failure could mean ruin. Fear of mercenaries and bandits also influenced social structures. Peasants became more dependent on local lords for protection, reinforcing feudal hierarchies, while some ambitious rulers exploited mercenary forces to suppress rebellion. In a way, these soldiers were a tool and a threat, at the same time a living embodiment of the empire's instability. Even the Black Death later would find Germany already fractured, making communities vulnerable to both disease and human predation. By the late Middle Ages, the legacy of mercenaries and banditry was clear. They reshaped towns, influenced political alliances, and forced both rulers and ordinary citizens to rethink loyalty, security, and survival. Castles and city walls weren't just symbols of wealth, they were shields against unpredictable violence. And while later chapters would see organized armies and imperial law improve stability, for centuries, the shadow of mercenaries and marauders defined what it meant to live in medieval Germany. The story of soldiers for hire reminds us that power wasn't just about kings or emperors, it was about who could command loyalty, fear, and gold, often all at once. And in a world where alliances shifted as easily as coins changed hands, survival was never guaranteed. And the line between protector and predator was razor thin. The Black Death. How plague reshaped power dynamics. In the mid-14th century, a shadow swept across Europe that no army could stop and no castle could hold back. It moved silently, invisibly, carried by rats, fleas, and human fear. The Black Death didn't just kill it, overturned everything people thought they knew about power, society, and survival. In Germany, this was more than a health crisis. It was a crisis of authority, wealth, and social structure. And yes, before we plunge into this dark chapter, a quick note. Let's aim for 1,000 likes. It helps keep these stories alive and lets history echo as loudly as the footsteps of those fleeing the plague. The disease arrived around 1347, sweeping from town to town, village to village, leaving devastation in its wake. Estimates suggest that up to half of Europe's population perished, and Germany was no exception. Entire villages emptied overnight, markets shut down, and labour vanished as quickly as life itself. Nobles, who had long relied on the steady work of peasants, suddenly faced a terrifying reality. Their lands could no longer sustain them if there were no hands to till the fields. Meanwhile, surviving peasants discovered a new, uneasy leverage. Labour was scarce, and for the first time in generations, they could demand better wages, lower rents, or even leave oppressive estates entirely. This shift in labour power was seismic. The old feudal order, which had kept peasants tied to the land, began to wobble. Lords struggled to enforce their authority, and some were forced to negotiate rather than command. This directly ties back to the earlier revolts we discussed, like the German Peasants' War centuries later, where peasants learned that collective pressure could bend authority. The Black Death accelerated this lesson on a continental scale, reshaping the relationship between rulers and the ruled in ways that would echo for decades. Beyond economics, the plague also shifted political dynamics. Cities, already growing in wealth and independence, became even more powerful. Trade hubs like those in the Hanseatic League could leverage their resources, surviving or even thriving while surrounding territories floundered. Princes and bishops, who once relied on rigid feudal hierarchies, found their influence diluted as localities gained bargaining power and autonomy. Even the centralizing ambitions of emperors, like Otto III's dreams centuries earlier, were hampered not by rebellion, but by demographic collapse and the sheer unpredictability of human mortality. Fear also transformed social and religious life. People sought explanations for a disaster that seemed utterly beyond human control. Superstitions, scapegoating, and religious fervor rose dramatically. Jews and other minority communities were falsely blamed for the plague, leading to horrific massacres. Witch hunts, which we'll explore later, gained momentum from this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. And while the Black Death was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, it paradoxically created opportunities for social mobility, innovation, and the questioning of old hierarchies. Interestingly, the plague even influenced military and political structures. With populations reduced, some mercenary bands, like those we'll discuss in another subtopic, found new power as armies adapted to smaller numbers. Fortifications, castles, and cities became more self-reliant, emphasizing defense and autonomy. In essence, the Black Death didn't just kill it, rewrote the rules of authority, wealth, and societal organization. So, when you look back at medieval Germany, the Black Death stands as a grim pivot point. It reminds us that history isn't just shaped by kings, battles, or dynasties, it's shaped by the forces of nature and the ways humans respond to crisis. Power can crumble as quickly as life itself, and in that collapse, the world shifts, quietly, irrevocably, in the hands of those who survive. And remember, if you're following along, help us hit 1,000 likes so these stories continue to breathe life into history as vividly as they did in the streets and fields of medieval Germany. Teutonic Order campaigns, holy wars on German soil. When most people think of medieval Germany, they picture knights in shining armor and towering castles, but there was another force that shaped the region in ways both brutal and transformative: the Teutonic Order. Originally founded during the Crusades in the Holy Land, this military religious order didn't stay put. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they had shifted their campaigns to the Baltic and Germanic lands, waging what they called holy wars against pagan tribes and anyone standing in the way of their expansion. These campaigns were as much about faith as they were about territory, wealth, and political influence, and they left a mark on Germany that would resonate for generations. The Teutonic Knights were no ordinary army. Their members took monastic vows, combining religious devotion with military discipline. But don't mistake piety for mercy. Their campaigns were organized, strategic, and ruthless. They built fortified castles in conquered lands, establishing strongholds that projected power deep into contested regions. Towns and villages were often caught in the crossfire, forced to provide supplies, labor, or allegiance, or face annihilation. This wasn't simply warfare. It was a system designed to extend both political and ecclesiastical control, creating zones where the Teutonic Order acted as judge, governor, and military authority all at once. Interestingly, the campaigns of the Teutonic Order intersected with the feudal and regional dynamics we've seen earlier. Local princes sometimes allied with the order to expand their influence, lending troops or resources in exchange for territorial gains. At other times, they opposed the knights, worried about the order's growing autonomy and ambition. It's a reminder that medieval Germany was never a straightforward hierarchy. Power was contested constantly, whether by princes, dukes, emperors, or military religious orders. The Teutonic campaigns were just one of many threads in this intricate web of competing authorities. Religion was central to the order's justification. The Pope endorsed their campaigns, framing them as crusades to convert pagan populations and defend Christendom. For the knights themselves, spiritual reward was promised alongside earthly spoils. Yet, the human cost was staggering. Entire communities were uprooted, villages razed, and political structures rewritten to align with Teutonic control. Survivors were often coerced into new social and religious hierarchies, blending local customs with the strict codes imposed by the knights. These efforts were a form of social engineering, a blend of conquest and conversion that reshaped the cultural and political map of northern Germany. The Teutonic Order also left an enduring architectural legacy. Many of the castles they built became centers of administration and military training, later influencing the designs of other German fortifications. These fortresses weren't just practical. They were symbols of authority, signaling to anyone who approached that this was Teutonic territory. For local populations, they were a constant reminder of both power and fear, much like the fear used in witch hunts or the displays of force by feudal lords. The order mastered the combination of religious legitimacy and military strength, a dual authority that echoed the strategies of Charlemagne and later emperors. Beyond their castles and military campaigns, the order also had a lasting influence on trade and economic development. Towns under Teutonic control often became hubs for commerce, with markets, roads, and ports established to support both the knights and the local population. This helped northern Germany integrate into broader European trade networks, giving cities an unprecedented level of wealth and autonomy. Yet this prosperity came at a cost. Strict regulations, taxation, and enforcement ensured that the order's authority remained unchallenged, demonstrating once again how control, wealth, and faith were inseparably intertwined. Over time, the Teutonic campaigns contributed to the consolidation of the Holy Roman Empire in the north, even if indirectly. By pacifying borderlands, securing trade routes, and creating loyal administrative centers, the order's influence helped define political boundaries and hierarchies. Their campaigns weren't just isolated conflicts, they were part of the broader struggle to organize, control, and legitimize authority in a fragmented Germany, where princes, bishops, and emperors constantly vied for dominance. Their interactions with the rising Hanseatic League also highlighted the complex relationship between military, political, and economic power, foreshadowing conflicts and alliances that would shape the region for centuries. Ultimately, the story of the Teutonic Order in Germany is a story of faith intertwined with power. It shows how religion could be wielded as a tool for conquest, how military might reinforce political ambitions, and how holy wars could leave both destruction and lasting structures in their wake. These campaigns were a crucible in which medieval Germany's political and religious landscape was forged, blending devotion, violence, and strategy in ways that shaped the empire for centuries to come. They remind us that history isn't just about kings and castles, it's also about orders, armies, and ideologies that could bend entire societies to their will. Imperial cities, wealth, independence, and constant struggle. When you hear medieval Germany, your mind probably jumps to sprawling castles, mighty emperors, and warring princes. But tucked between those power struggles were the imperial cities' dynamic hubs that thrived on commerce, diplomacy, and a stubborn streak for independence. Unlike most towns under a noble or bishop, these cities answered directly to the emperor, which sounds impressive, but in practice, it meant walking a tightrope between autonomy and constant political pressure. Imperial cities like Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and Cologne weren't just population centers, they were economic powerhouses. Merchants hustled goods from textiles to spices, craftsmen produced fine metalwork, and markets buzzed with activity that reached far beyond their walls. Their wealth allowed cities to fund their own defenses, negotiate treaties, and maintain a level of independence that most other settlements could only dream of. In a way, they were the economic heartbeats of the empire, fueling both trade and the ambitions of local princes who wanted a slice of that prosperity. Some cities even established trade networks that rivaled or complemented the Hanseatic League, allowing them to wield influence that reached far beyond Germany's borders. Yet wealth brought danger as much as opportunity. Imperial cities were constantly negotiating their position between the emperor, regional princes, and sometimes even the Hanseatic League. A city too loyal to a weak emperor risked angering powerful neighbors. A city too assertive risked imperial retribution. Every decision from levying city taxes to maintaining a militia was a strategic move in a high-stakes game of survival. One wrong alliance could lead to siege or economic sanctions. In some cases, rival princes would attempt to surround a city with their own fortresses or impose tolls along trade routes to weaken its influence. And when disputes escalated, imperial cities weren't shy about using their wealth to hire mercenaries, further blurring the lines between civic independence and military power, reminiscent of the mercenary tensions we see elsewhere in medieval Germany. The governance of these cities was fascinating. Councils made up of merchants and guild leaders often ran day-to-day affairs, with mayors balancing power between elite families and wider citizen interests. This form of civic administration was a precursor to more modern political systems, but it also created constant internal tension. Rival factions jostled for influence, debates raged over trade monopolies, and sometimes citizens took to the streets in revolt. Guilds could wield enormous influence, controlling who could trade certain goods or practice certain crafts, giving them leverage over both the city council and visiting merchants. The struggle wasn't just external, it was internal too. Living in an imperial city meant prosperity came with political responsibility, social friction, and constant negotiation. The cities also played critical roles in larger imperial politics. During succession, disputes or conflicts between emperors and princes, imperial cities could tip the balance. They controlled supply routes, minted coins, and provided resources that armies needed to function. Much like the Hanseatic League, their collective influence could sometimes outmatch individual princes. A rebellious city could resist taxation, block trade, or even refuse to host imperial courts, subtly shaping the empire from within. Cities like Augsburg or Lübeck often found themselves mediating disputes between rival nobles, proving that economic power could translate directly into political clout. Religion added another layer of complexity. Cathedrals, monasteries, and bishoprics were often embedded within or near imperial cities, creating arenas for tension between civic independence and ecclesiastical authority. Religious disputes could become flashpoints, as citizens sometimes resisted clerical interference while still navigating broader church politics. Festivals, processions, and local saints' days weren't just spiritual, they were also exercises in civic identity, reinforcing a city's autonomy and pride. Add in the looming threat of witch hunts, the constant pressure of peasant unrest, or the shifting loyalties of nearby nobles, and life in an imperial city was a constant balancing act, demanding shrewd diplomacy and an eye for opportunity. Despite these challenges, the resilience of imperial cities is remarkable. They thrived not just because of commerce, but because their citizens mastered negotiation, strategy, and self-governance. They became symbols of how wealth and civic organization could coexist with, and sometimes challenge the traditional power of princes and emperors. Cities learned to leverage their independence while maintaining enough loyalty to the crown to avoid outright war. A delicate dance that defined much of Germany's political landscape in the Middle Ages. So, when looking at medieval Germany, it's worth remembering that the story isn't only about castles or crowns. The imperial cities remind us that power could flow from streets and markets as much as from thrones. Their wealth, independence, and perpetual struggles paint a vivid picture of a society where commerce, politics, and ambition intersected, creating hubs of influence that shaped the empire in ways armies alone could never achieve. In a land dominated by nobles, the imperial cities proved that resilience, strategy, and collective will could turn bricks, coins, and guild charters into real power, leaving a legacy that echoes in German cities to this very day. The Habsburg seeds: marriage, manipulation, and empire building. When we think of empires, we often imagine armies clashing on battlefields or kings asserting authority through sheer force. But in medieval Germany, some of the most powerful strategies weren't fought with swords. They were played out in grand halls with velvet gowns, gold rings, and carefully chosen spouses. The rise of the Habsburgs shows just how lethal a well-placed marriage could be, turning alliances into dynasties and subtle manipulation into empire building. The story begins in the early medieval period, when the Habsburg family held modest lands along the Swiss-Austrian border. They weren't born rulers of vast territories, but they had an eye for opportunity. Unlike other noble families that relied solely on military conquest, the Habsburgs perfected the art of strategic marriage. A bride here, a groom there. Each union carefully negotiated to extend influence, secure loyalty, or inherit distant lands. Their motto could have been, "Let others fight while we marry our way to power," and it worked astonishingly well. Marriage wasn't just a personal affair, it was political warfare disguised as celebration. Through unions, the Habsburgs gained control over key duchies, counties, and eventually kingdoms. They interwove their bloodline with other influential European families, ensuring that their descendants had claims far beyond their original holdings. One clever alliance could neutralize a rival, while another could bring entire regions under their indirect control. It wasn't brute force. It was patience, cunning, and a sense of timing that rivaled the most strategic generals of the era. But their strategy wasn't only about titles and land. Each marriage allowed them to forge networks of loyalty that reached deep into the political and religious structures of the Holy Roman Empire. Bishops, whose votes and favour were often crucial to securing the throne, were influenced through family connections and carefully orchestrated alliances. Electors, too, could be courted, bribed, or persuaded by the Habsburgs' extensive web of relationships. By embedding themselves into multiple layers of power, they ensured that no major decision from coronations to territorial disputes was made without some Habsburg influence lurking in the background. Manipulation extended beyond the marriage bed. The Habsburgs understood that appearances, promises, and subtle persuasion could achieve what armies sometimes could not. Treaties, inheritances, and papal favours were tools they wielded as skillfully as swords. By the time the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I came onto the scene, the groundwork for a sprawling Habsburg empire was already laid, thanks to centuries of calculated alliances and careful nurturing of claims. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you marry wisely," became almost prophetic. This strategy also linked directly to the complex politics of the empire. Remember the electors we discussed earlier? Their support was crucial for any emperor's coronation. The Habsburgs' extensive network of familial ties across German principalities made it easier to secure these votes, consolidate power, and assert legitimacy. Bishops, too, could be influenced through marriage alliances, patronage, or strategic favour, further blurring the lines between church and state power. In essence, the Habsburgs turned relationships into a vast web of influence that connected politics, religion, and territorial control. Interestingly, their methods also affected broader society. By controlling lands indirectly through marriage, they could influence local economies, trade routes, and even city governance without the constant need for military enforcement. Cities in the Hanseatic League, mercenary companies, and even peasant communities found themselves navigating a landscape shaped by these quiet, calculated moves. Even in times of revolt or plague, the Habsburgs' family ties often allowed them to retain stability and manage crises more effectively than rulers who relied solely on brute force. In many ways, the Habsburgs' rise foreshadowed modern statecraft, where diplomacy, marriage, and manipulation could be as decisive as any battlefield victory. The seeds planted in these early centuries grew into a dynasty that dominated European politics for centuries. The Habsburgs didn't simply inherit power, they engineered it, generation by generation. Their story reminds us that empires aren't always forged in fire and blood. Sometimes they are cultivated with patience, strategy, and a keen understanding of human ambition. By turning marriage into a tool of empire, the Habsburgs left a legacy of influence that shaped not only medieval Germany, but the entire trajectory of European history. From the lowliest duchy to the imperial throne, their fingerprints were everywhere, a testament to the quiet but unstoppable force of strategy, patience, and ambition. Legacy of medieval Germany. Myth, memory, and modern controversy. When people think of medieval Germany, images of knights in shining armor, stone castles perched on hills, and vast dark forests immediately come to mind. But that's only part of the story. The real legacy of medieval Germany is far messier, far more complex, and far more fascinating than any romanticized picture. The period left an indelible mark on European history, shaping politics, religion, cities, and even modern perceptions of what Germany is today. From the rise of the Holy Roman Empire under the shadow of Charlemagne to dynastic wars like the infamous Hohenstaufen-Welf rivalry, everything from power struggles to plagues has echoes that still resonate centuries later. One of the biggest misconceptions about medieval Germany is the idea that it was ever a centralized, unified state. In truth, it was a patchwork of semi-independent principalities, bishoprics, and imperial cities. Kings ruled, yes, but their authority was always contested. Princes, dukes, and even bishops could, and often did, push back against imperial power. The very structure of the Holy Roman Empire meant that compromise, negotiation, and sometimes outright rebellion were essential to survival. This decentralized reality connects directly to other stories we've explored, like the fierce clashes between bishops and secular princes, the constant threat of mercenary armies, and even the political maneuverings of Otto III and Frederick Barbarossa. Authority was never absolute, and the empire's enduring challenge was balancing ambition with practical reality. Memory plays a huge role in how we understand this era. Romanticized accounts from later centuries turned knights into heroes, castles into idyllic fortresses, and feuds into legendary sagas. But the reality was far harsher. Castles were not only defensive structures but also symbols of control and oppression, and dynastic rivalries often meant hardship for ordinary people. The Hohenstaufen-Welf feud, for instance, wasn't just a dramatic story, it led to destruction, forced loyalties, and widespread instability. Even events like the rise of the Hanseatic League weren't mere economic tales. They were direct responses to centuries of fragmented authority, violence, and lawlessness. Wealthy cities had to protect themselves, negotiate trade privileges, and navigate the ever-shifting power of princes and bishops. Modern controversy adds another layer to the legacy. Nationalist interpretations in the 19th and 20th centuries often painted medieval Germany as a symbol of strength, unity, or destiny, downplaying the fragmentation, conflict, and oppression that was so characteristic of the period. On the other hand, historians highlighting the darker side remind us of peasants, revolts, witch hunts, mercenary violence, and political manipulation, showing a society struggling with inequality, fear, and ambition. Even today, debates continue over whether centralization efforts by emperors like Otto III or Frederick Barbarossa were visionary or authoritarian overreach. These discussions reveal not only the complexity of medieval politics, but also the human tendency to reinterpret history to suit present needs. Cultural memory also shapes perception. Literature, film, and reenactments celebrate heroic deeds, elaborate architecture, and epic battles, while the messy realities of political intrigue, assassinations, and territorial disputes are often overlooked. But these complexities are essential to understanding the empire's evolution. Ordinary people's lives were caught between competing powers, just as they would later be during peasant revolts or outbreaks of plague. Fear, superstition, and religious authority weren't just spiritual matters, they were political tools, demonstrating that power was never solely about swords or crowns, but also about control over belief, loyalty, and public perception. The legacy extends into governance and society. Medieval Germany pioneered early forms of civic autonomy, legal privileges for towns, and the negotiation of power between church and state. Imperial cities, despite pressures from princes and bishops, carved out spaces of relative independence. The balance of authority, negotiation, and local resistance created a dynamic political culture that shaped the trajectory of German-speaking Europe for centuries. Even the infamous mercenary armies of the era, while often brutal, inadvertently encouraged urban organization, fortifications, and cooperative defense. Measures a lesson in how chaos can inspire innovation. In the end, medieval Germany's story is not just about kings or battles. It's about human ambition, resilience, and the constant struggle to define authority. Myth, memory, and controversy collide to form a legacy that is as fascinating as it is instructive. The echoes of dynastic wars, religious power struggles, peasant revolts, and city independence are still visible today in culture, politics, and historical debates. Medieval Germany reminds us that history is not static. It is alive, contested, and shaped by how we choose to remember it. The castles, the robes of bishops, the crowns of emperors, they all tell a story of a society striving, failing, and adapting, leaving a legacy that continues to intrigue, challenge, and inspire centuries later. Thanks for joining me on this quiet journey through medieval Germany. From castles and princes to hidden secrets and everyday life, we've explored it all at a calm pace. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe for more stories like this, leave a comment sharing your favorite part, and give it a like. Let's aim for 1,000 likes as a little milestone together. Now, let your mind relax, let the stories settle, and drift off peacefully. We'll see you in the next video.